Winshart. George Winshart was one of these very, very active and important members of this group of men that were preaching this reformed idea, that, preaching the true word. And Winshart needed a bodyguard because the bishop's men were out to get him. And John Knox, believe it or not, was his bodyguard. And that's one of the most interesting stories of all. John Knox was a Catholic priest from Haddington. He was not eloquent in his speech. He was rather shy. He was a bookish sort. And the last thing he would want to be was up front, the face of any movement. But he was involved, and he had a very important role. He was the bodyguard for George Winshart. Now, one night, George Winshart, they were coming from Edinburgh, and George Winshart said, listen, you go along. I'm going to go on to wherever. You go and see your family for a bit. We'll meet up again. And Knox left. Well, the bishop's men were following. And they very quickly clapped hands on Winshart. They brought him here to St. Andrews. He was tried, found guilty of heresy, and he was executed just over here underneath this very inconsiderate car. Right here, GW. This is where the pyre stood. GW for George Winshart. Marked out cobbles on the road. The rest has been tarmashed over. This is marked out to mark this spot. Now, George Winshart burned at the stake here, and it is said that the wood was wet, the wood was sodden, as a matter of fact, and it took something like 8 hours for him to die. And the whole area was just filled with ash in St. Andrews. And they said, what was it? They said that the ash that more people would come to the message infected by this ash from George Winshart's death. I don't know, wherever it touched, something like that. Anyway, it happened right here. Why right here? Because that's the window. That's where Cardinal Beaton was, and he watched as Winshart burned. So the reformers were not happy about that. Now, do you want to tell them about the rest?
Yeah, we can do it from here. Can y'all I don't have a microphone, so if y'all could step in. Okay. On June the 6th, 1559, on these hills over here, you'll see them when we leave, John Knox is coming over the top of those hills. He is in the advance party of an army called the Lords of the Congregation. That's 3,000 strong. June the 6th, 1559. He stops and he thinks about what had occurred 12 years earlier when he had arrived here, and Winshart had, as you've already heard, and then told him, you go off and see your family, they're not that far away. He actually debated with him about doing it, but Winshart was the top dog, so when he said to go, they left. And so it was while he was there that they came and told him what had happened. And so for the next 2 years, he has a number of boys with him, including the Winshart family and others who had been killed. And he is actually teaching those kids, and they're moving from place to place to place. And then he hears that Cardinal Beaton is dead. Now that David Beaton is the guy that was responsible for the death of Winshart, and he looked from those windows up there. Now what I hadn't told you yet is that he had already killed a man who had been instrumental in Winshart's conversion and movement to the Reformed faith, and that was a guy by the name of Patrick Hamilton. Back in the 1520s, Patrick Hamilton had gone around preaching. Now, by the way, when these guys went around preaching, they knew they were being hunted. They were just kind of one step ahead of the bishop's guard, and trying to stay one step ahead. And they'd hear, and then but they knew they would be eventually caught. So Hamilton was caught. He was killed here at St. Andrews as well.
St. Salvator's, right out in front of the arch.
Right in front of where we're headed when you walk back towards St. Salvator's. And then of course Wishart is then killed here later. And I think Hamilton was put in the bottle dungeon, right?
No, it was.
I think it was after he was killed. He was thrown in or something like that. But anyway, so Knox eventually comes back here 2 years after Wishart, and he hears that that Beaton is dead. And not only has Beaton been put to death, but he's also heard that the reformers have taken over, and that the death of Wishart had caused some of them to take heart or take courage or whatever, so that they were now in control. So he comes over here and to find out, and he comes into this castle area, and when he arrives, he finds it garrisoned by the army of the Reformation, as it were. But when he comes in, he finds drunkenness, gambling. Then you'll find some soldiers having prayers. It's a mixed lot. And he goes up to a guy by the name of John Leslie, and he begins to talk to him about, what's going on here? Why is this behavior being tolerated? And Leslie says, well, he said, some of us are here for reasons of godliness, and some of us are here for other reasons, and we're going to take as many troops as we can to garrison this place. And so he said, you can stay or you can go, and Knox decided to stay and to cast his lot with them, and basically becomes like a military chaplain to the garrison that's here. It's not quite as successful as everybody thought it would be, because the French were brought in, and the French fleet was put out here, and they began to bombard the castle. And then, so they're trying to withstand the bombardment, and but they surrender, and so they then take away some of the people into captivity. One of them being Knox. So Knox is taken, and he's made a galley slave on a French warship, and serves almost 2 years on the French warship. So you've got this period of time now that's advancing on from Wishart's death, where he goes around and he's teaching. Then he comes back here and he becomes a military chaplain, and then he goes and he's put into the French galley slave, and usually that's a death sentence, and probably would have been eventually, except for some influential people in England who were able to gain his freedom. And so he comes to England, and he begins to preach and teach, and again becomes a military chaplain. He has a number of responsibilities, but as Mary begins to ascend the throne and all of the difficulties that come, he ends up fleeing England. Then he goes to Geneva. There in Geneva, he becomes pretty much, he's being discipled, the term we would use, mentored and taught underneath John Calvin, and also becomes part of Calvin's pastoral staff, as it were. And if you were with us, how many of you are with me in Geneva? Do you remember the Institute Hall off to the side of St. Peter's? Well, that was basically his church. That was also where Calvin would lecture every morning, and from his lectures come most of Calvin's commentaries. But it was also the place where the international congregation of refugees would meet. And Knox basically became their pastor and worked with them. He also worked on the Geneva Bible in English. Now, the Geneva Bible had already been translated into French, and it was now being translated into English, and he worked on that translation. He made one trip over here to preach, and then he went back, and then while he was here, I think is when he got married, and then he goes back and he takes his wife with him, which was quite a sacrifice. She was a woman of some means, and but she goes back with him, and they have 2 boys, and then she comes back with him when he arrives back with the famous "Give me Scotland or I die" prayer. And now he has been trained not only as a pastor, but also his perspectives on the relationship of church and state, and those 3 basic institutions of church, state, and family have been pretty much ingrained within him, and how he thinks things ought to progress. So he has no place for a state church whatsoever. The church does not advance with the powers of the state, which is the power of the sword. The church advances with the power of the sword of truth, the Word of God, and through the means of grace, preaching, fellowship, sacraments, and prayer. And so that's what he is fully convinced of. Now, he knows that's going to have ramifications politically, but he is not attempting to do a political movement. And you've heard Karen tell you that he arrives at churches where, after his sermons on what is true worship, dealing with the fact that you should not have images, some had, and then when he would preach these fiery sermons, some, when he would leave, many would take it to another level, very much the way they did with Luther's sermons, and in the iconoclastic wars that would go on. And so, but Knox was actually a little bit more measured than that. And he said, no, these are places that have been used for worship. They've been used wrongly, but they've been consecrated places. We shouldn't go in and do violence to them. He believed that should take place with persuasion over a period of time, and the key was the pulpit and preaching, and not by force, that those things were to be done. So that he was not attempting to be radical in that sense, in terms of using physical force. But anyway, so he comes back and he begins to preach, and then he comes over here. And on June the 6th, 1559, he ascends this hill with 3,000 troops behind him, called the Lords of the Congregation. And as they arrive and look down, he remembers back when he was here, and from which he went into a galley slave. He also remembers back prior to that when Winshart had been killed here. He remembers back for Patrick Hamilton, and they arrive and they come in and they are now able to occupy this place. And now he comes back and he's preaching the Word of God. Eventually he gets over to, as you've been, over to St. Giles, and that becomes his pulpit focus of ministry. There he will debate Queen Mary. They will have disputations. It's not hard to figure out who was winning the disputations, but also who had the power to try to stop him, which of course is what she would do. So, his wife would die, and he would remarry again. And the thing that absolutely grated on Mary was that he married a member of the Stuart family, Margaret Stuart. That she did not take kindly to that at all. And I sometimes wonder. Of course, he marries a 17-year-old or 15-year-old, I can't remember, 17, and he's 50-something at the time. Now, I don't think he was trying to get a trophy wife. That was pretty common in those days, that you'd have one wife, and if you outlived her, it was nice to get another wife. And so sometimes a woman would be drawn to that and help you raise the children that you already have, or to help you on in your age. I asked my wife, would she marry again if I died before her? And men, I don't think you want to ask your wives that question. It's kind of like, are you kidding? I've done this once. You mean I'm going to do that again? But anyway, he remarried, and you saw the house that he spent some of his time in. So is that connecting some dots for you and putting it together? All right. Does anybody have any questions you want to ask? Okay, well, you'll go and see where we'll go to the pulpit, or the area from where he preached. and we'll also see the castle, which is where he would have been when he was ministering to those that had occupied the castle, from which he went into slavery, and then he came back here 12 years later, and on June the 7th entered 1559, and the Reformation continues and moves on throughout Scotland. Of course, you will, this was one other thing I want to mention to you. Oh, also here at St. Andrews, to connect the dots again, fast forward about 100 years, and also another man is going to be put to death here. Remember yesterday when you were in the Magdalene Chapel, and we talked about the Covenanters, and another great Covenanter will be put to death here, and also, if I'm not mistaken, will be put in the bottle dungeon himself. His name was James Guthrie. And if you can ever get your hands on the sermon he preached, The Causes of the Lord's Wrath Upon Nations, it is powerful. That joined, as I mentioned yesterday, to Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex. So Guthrie is put to death, and they would have put Samuel Rutherford to death, but he dies here in St. Andrew from a fever that he had about a couple of months, I think it was, after his daughter died. And he actually was able to hold his daughter's hand while she was dying, and then he would die, but they were going to put him to death as well. So you've got two sections here at St. Andrew: Reformation time and the Covenanters 100 years later. Okay.
Yeah. Was there a specific message that they were preaching? Was it just the overall, or was there something specific they were saying that got them in trouble?
Well, there was a number of things that got them in trouble. One is the supremacy of the Scriptures over the tradition of the church. Now, folks, I know you won't make this mistake, but many do. They say, well, the Reformers believed in the inerrancy and the infallibility of the Scriptures, and the Roman Church, the infallibility of the Pope. Actually, that's not accurate. The Roman Church believed in the infallibility of the speaking church through its councils. And then it goes back into the councils to say from a council, I believe a misreading of a council statement, that whenever the Pope would speak ex cathedra from the throne, from his place as the vicar of Christ, then at that point he was infallible. But his infallibility was based upon the council statement. And then secondly, of course, the most important thing is what sent Luther into the rage. As Luther sees the use of the doctrine of purgatory, and then he sees the church funding itself through the fears of the people, and Tetzel's every time into the coffer a coin rings, then another soul from purgatory springs. And he saw that manipulation of the people. He had no time for it. And then you join that with the fact he had finally found peace with God, not in works of penance, but in the finished work of Christ on the cross. And so that you're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Now some would say, well, wouldn't the Roman Church have believed you're saved by the work of Christ? Answer, yes, but not the word alone. The key word in the Reformation is the word sola, the word alone. Now, the Reformers knew that when you got saved by grace, that would never be alone, because grace would change you. And faith is never alone. It's evidenced by works. But you're saved not by your faith plus your works. You're saved by the work of Christ. Now, your saving faith will work, but it's not your works that enhance his work. Your works are just the evidence of your faith. His work is what saves you, and it's full and complete and isn't added to it. Well, that was the ultimate issue, and so, for instance, not long ago, I did the debate in Birmingham with some of the Orthodox and Roman churches, and what was evident when people come up to me afterwards was, it's really interesting, as y'all were debating, you kept quoting the Bible, they kept quoting the church fathers. And that was because that is their ultimate. When you say that the Scriptures and the councils are equal authority, there's never an equal authority. One will always ascend to the other, and men love the work of their hands more than the work of God unless God's grace intervenes in your life. Okay, so those were the key issues that was being preached. So when you talk about the Reformed faith, what you're talking about is really recapturing the apostolic gospel. That's what you're talking about.
Well, let's go into the cathedral. Have a look in there. Then when we're done in